Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here and showing up on this sunny, what day is it? Sunny Saturday. I just want to give a big thank you to Emily and Charo and Margaret and the Kamloops Art Gallery for hosting this exhibition. And as Emily said, this is my first survey presentation of a large body of work that spans research back all the way to 2017. And a lot of the history and the work looks at my father's family history on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, also known as Vancouver. And I thought I would kind of navigate the talk around a couple of kind of key, I guess it's ways of working through material from communities like the Japanese Canadian community, where there is now a lot of information around the internment, but the process of arriving to that and getting to that through the course of the decade has been informed by the different types of lenses that have documented it. So if people aren't aware, cameras and radios were confiscated from Japanese Canadian families right before they entered the internment. So as a media artist, I'm always fascinated with how the internment is pictured and how it's archived. And a big memory that I have in my own family is before, so they were Japanese Canadian settler farmers in Walnut Grove, and they took turns burning a Kodak Brownie. So they took turns burning this camera before they got sent to the internment camp. And so as a media artist, I'm always looking through these archives of government-sanctioned photographs, and then a material recovery of stories that have been lost and obliterated. It's also kind of key to note that the forced dispersal of Japanese Canadians made it very difficult for elders to speak about their history again. And so to have them come back into a process of engaging with oral histories or speaking with me also is a process that takes time. So it's not something that arrives in your first introduction to someone or in your first introduction to your grandparents. So I often think of my practice first as memory work, so an engagement to the past, thinking about memory. It's kind of like a constellation making, because I'll be working on one chart of images here and I don't understand the meaning of it till maybe 15 or 10 years later. You see the larger scope of something, and that iteration makes sense to the work over here. So I just want to thank Charo, because these opportunities to do a survey show makes you really think about all the things. And so my talk also kind of looks at the string of related and unrelated stories that kind of happened through the course of this sifting through this material and trying to materially recover content. And if there's any questions, since we're a small group, just raise hands and things like that, especially if there's specificities around historic information that I'm missing. This image that we're looking at is a crowd waving goodbye to men on a CNR train. And it's at the Vancouver Public Library. And the image of the man sort of extending with his hands perched like this is my grandfather. And that's my first instance of identifying him inside an archive. And I remember having this strange conversation with the archivist at the VPL being, I'd like to purchase this photograph. And at the time, I think you couldn't get a copy. So there were all these things happening where he was like, we can't give it to you. You can't use it for your artwork. You can't do this. And so these conversations, this is back in the early 2000s, I think, when I was doing my master's. And now if you go to the site, it's like it's public domain. Anybody can kind of use it for presentations. But this is sort of my first kind of instance of coming to and arriving to the picture of my grandfather, who still kind of is a bit of a mystery in the sense that when the Japanese Canadians were sent to internment camp, the men were sent before if they had particular skills in logging. And so my grandfather actually was sent and separated from the family to build the camps that then their families would be in. And so my family has a rare experience of not just staying in one camp, but going through a series of them. So Sandon, Slocan, Popoff, Bay Farm, because he kept having to move to build the camps and the family would have to trace where he went. And then they all ended up in Slocan. While I was doing my MFA in Simon Fraser University. I studied with Dr. Kristen Emiko McAllister, who's a memory scholar. And she introduced me to this idea of memory work through Annette Kuhn, which is an active practice of remembrance, which takes an inquiring attitude towards the past and the activity of its reconstruction through memory. So that word keeps coming up in my practice, so I just want to locate where that's from. And I'm always interested also in this idea of post-memory. So the image that we're also looking at the top is, I ended up in 2013 moving back to my old childhood home, which was where all my family members moved back to after they were exiled. So they were interned, and then after they were released from camps, they were exiled to Japan, and then they came back after the regulations for Japanese Canadian bodies to be able to enter Canada again in 1949, I think. They all came back again in the 60s and moved into this home that I'm in now, where my studio is. And so I live with the relics of traces of objects, which I sometimes call testimonial objects, which is also, I think it's a term by Leo Spitzer, but it's when the historic object can radiate or speak out things or carry stories inside it. And so this at the top is it says at the top Mochizuki, and I think there's a number 12773. Whoever has written this has spelled repatriate wrong, so retapipite, but it should be a Japanese repatriate, and trans-Pacific passenger, and I think there's an address on here. So this, when Japanese Canadians were removed from the West Coast, they could only carry a certain weight of luggage. And so this is one of the luggage cases that went with them to the camps, all through those camps that I listed, and then also to Japan and came back, and lives in my basement with a whole bunch of things in it that I haven't really fully looked through. So it kind of lives, and I kind of imagine that it just radiates these things and lives there. I opened it once, and it had, my grandmother was a seamstress, so it had a lot of dress patterns and nets and things. I often also talk about this term by Marianne Hirsch called post-memory. And in a nutshell, it describes that a generation that's removed from the historic trauma. So I would be fourth generation Yonsei, Japanese Canadian. So as someone that hadn't gone through the internment, I'm looking to those elders that are still alive that could tell the story through words. And then through art, so through investment projection and creation, I'm making something using what the government has documented, what they say, and the things that I'm making through art, and also acknowledging the gaps and the silences and what's not said. So all of that kind of pieced together make this history and the stories. So oftentimes in my work, rather than sort of a linear narrative, like the installation Autumn Strawberry, you're gonna get things in pieces and fragments. And oftentimes that's how the work arrives down to me or is passed to me. And I think it's important to keep it in those states or in those processes. Anyways, I think the trunk is haunted. It lives in my house. It lives in my basement. This is a still from Compass 2017, which is a 30-minute performance that was performed in Richmond. And it just has a text up there. We have no recordings of the internment other than what you could have said, what I remember you said, and what you couldn't say. And it really speaks to not knowing my grandfather. So my grandfather was born in 1970, or passed away in 1976, which is the year I was born. So I don't have a connection to him. My grandmother also has passed away, my father has passed away, and 2 aunts have passed away. So who remains now are just 3 of my aunts. So it's the aunts with the matching vests, which are all made of potato sacks, and the scraps that they had. So that was the last day of internment camp. And strangely enough, cameras weren't allowed in the camp, so somebody had come to take their portrait. And that's the only image that I have of evidence of them at camp. So it's their family leaving Slocan internment camp in 1946. And so inside this memory work, there's also this precarious nature that the elders and the speakers that I still speak to are also in their 90s. And they're trying to remember things of when they were kids. So there's that slippery terrain of what is actual, what is true, what is being lost, like, are these things fictions? Is it real? So there's this tenuous nature of memory work as well that happens in the work. This photograph on this side is my dad's family and life in Fukuoka in the 50s. So after internment, they were exiled to Japan. And the story there is that because their bodies were seen in Japan as American nationals, their own family back then didn't really treat them with respect. And so when they came over to Japan, they were just also othered at the same time and didn't have the greatest of experience. This aunt, who's still alive at 91, basically pretended she was a little bit older, and her body could speak both English and Japanese, so she worked for the American PX in Japan and was able to make enough money to buy 2 farmlands and a home so that the family could thrive in Shizuoka and Fukuoka. And she basically took the risk to come back to Canada when they were allowed and brought everybody back home by 1961 and is still alive. So we celebrate her. She's a Capricorn, and we celebrate her in January all the time. This is a piece that was at the Alternator Art Gallery, actually, called Dawn to Dust. And I just wanted to also speak about animation and drawing in my work and how tracing and the drawn image is significant. And in this work, Lines to Remember, it's a video work. I had spent a little bit of time, and you'll see that work later, in Japan. And while I'm in Japan and I get those moments to be in Japan, I try to go back to find the places that they were exiled to. So for a little while, it's gone now completely, but up until maybe early 2000s, this house was there that aunt had purchased, and they all lived in this house. And the story with this house was every Japanese house had a large snake spirit that was like 35 feet. If it's real or not, I don't know, but they would, if I asked them about this house, they would talk about this big snake spirit that lived there. I think it's not true, because I don't think 35 feet snakes existed, but in their mind, they believed the snake lived there. On the side of this house are ads, so they wanted to make extra money. You could put advertisement on the side of the house because trains would pass by, and it was just a way of advertising. And they all lived in this house. And while I was in Shizuoka, my father, before he passed, left us a hand-drawn map of how to find this place. And so I got super excited. My brother lives in Tokyo. We snuck out, we took a little plane over, and we're like, let's go find this place. And I forgot the map in Vancouver. And so I had to, call my mom, how is this? And we walked for hours and hours and hours. And because I had done this work, Lines to Remember, where I got all the aunts to draw out the house. So I remembered key things like they remembered the statue. There was a Buddhist statue because there was a cemetery beside the house. There was a mandarin tree. There were these things. After 2 hours, we were able to find where that house was, but it was in fact gone, and a senior home was built over it. So many of my, in the kind of realm of memory work, post-memory, we have all these precarious little elements or pieces and clues, or what I call like a corner of a constellation to make a work. I think this work was made in 2017, but I feel that it then later went and influenced the work that's up at the back called Autumn Strawberry, and it really pushed my work towards animation because of my maybe mistrust in photographs and wanting to create an aesthetic that best suit how to represent that history, and not just the internment, but the affect of it or the effects of it that trickle through family lines. Because I think that's probably the most important thing for me in terms of the work, and that there's so few of these seniors still alive that it's important to document how it was through their words versus what was produced through the government and what is produced through other kind of modes that come in to try to extract that history also, which is kind of something happening within our community as well. So this is an image, you'll see it come up in Autumn Strawberry, and it's a tracing of berry farmers over through the scrim. So being here in Kamloops, how did this come up, Charo?
Mochizuki.
Okay, so they're in that's right. So every time Kamloops comes up. My aunt that brought the whole family back says, Cindy, if you ever get back there, ever in your life, you have to remember to lay flowers down on this man's grave, Mr. Nonomura. And that's him here. And my grandfather, he was basically, if you were an Issei, so my grandfather was a first generation from Japan, you had to be sponsored over, have to have known somebody. You might have gotten a letter called the Yobiyose letter, which is this very lyrical and poetic letter from someone from your region that's like, hey, come over to Canada. There's jumping fish, beautiful ocean, lush trees. You'll love it here. We're going to do well. It's kind of like Gold Mountain for the Chinese Canadian community, but for Japanese Canadian community, dream of riches. Not knowing, obviously, that they're entering into lands that don't belong to them as Japanese settlers also. So Mr. Nonomura was an individual that brought the entire family in and remained in Kamloops and Griffin Lake and passed away. And so when we opened the show here, I reached out to my named doppelganger, Cindy Mochizuki, who is the archivist she worked at the city of administrator, and asked her, I'm trying to trace a grave of this man, and she reached out to the Kamloops Japanese Canadian Buddhist temple, and we were able to find his stone, and I was able to leave an offering and wash his grave with water before I opened my exhibition on April 20th, which happened to be my dad's birthday, should he have been alive. I'm going to talk a little bit about getting into autumn strawberry. So as I had mentioned, my grandparents had berry farms in Walnut Grove, and I had always believed that this image, as indicated by my father, was my grandmother's farm, because that's what you believe, and it was, she kept photographs in like this liqueured chocolate box, so there's just stacks and stacks of them. And nothing is in order, and it's a sort of chaotic mess. And as I mentioned, the time of interment is a gap, and there's some things from the pre-interment era that's not properly documented. So this is who I thought, this woman here, who I thought was my grandmother. And after I opened the show in Surrey, I got an email from someone that said, the woman that you've been using for the Surrey Art Gallery poster is not your grandmother. It's my grandmother. And I thought, oh gosh, what's going on here? So it turns out it's my grandmother's sister, and they look like twins. And they had a rift and a falling out, and didn't keep in touch. And then they were able to help me to find that in my album, these ones were my grandmother's farm. So Sakie Takasaki, my grandmother's sister, had a more affluent, abundant farm in Maple Ridge, which was also known at that time as Haney. And my grandmother had a smaller farm in Walnut Grove. And so Jordan had asked me if I was, at the Surrey Art Gallery, if I was interested to do this piece and to look at an area called Strawberry Hill. And so the histories of Japanese Canadian settler farmers across Fraser Valley is similar. And so I decided, okay, I will do a residency at the Surrey Art Gallery Tech Lab. That's an image of Grace, one of our elders, Grace Aiko Thompson, coming in. And the Tech Lab was transformed into the space where any surviving Nisei that remembered the area of what was called Strawberry Hill in Surrey could come and have conversations with me, could bring in photographs. I had photographs of my dad and his sisters in the farms. And we had, through the community, there were people like Michael Hoshiko who documented all the Japanese families in Delta and Surrey that had farms. So we had kind of maps of things, and different families came forward. And I think the most kind of remarkable thing was that these elders, now in their 90s, would have been maybe 4 or 5 at the time, would come to tell these really short micro stories, and often centered around what they ate. Like, so mom made a pie, we pickled things, we had vats of miso and sake in the cellar. A woman came every Thursday with a different kind of pickle, a preserve for me to try. And so autumn strawberry became this like a really different thing. So when you see autumn strawberry, you'll see these like very large tree creatures stomping a big stone, which is called a tsukemono stone. So in Japanese culture, when we pickle, they use those big cedar barrels, which is what the trees are kind of bonking on. And you would take one of your largest stones and place it on top of the cellar as a kind of lucky thing too, I think, but also weight, so that you'd have the best daikon pickle throughout. So when the RCMP came and they removed everything, sometimes they just didn't know what to do with those vats of pickles. So I had to talk to a couple of elders, and they were like, it just must have just disintegrated down into the earth, and this pickles and miso and sake kind of spread through. And then I started thinking about inside Autumn Strawberry, one of the things that kind of complicates the history of Japanese Canadian settler farming is that they were given land from these white farmers to say, you can lease this. We're going to give you what they deemed as the worst land because they were huge Douglas fir trees all over. And so they were like, you're tasked to clear cut this entire body of land and embark in a technique called tree stumping, which involves dynamite. And many Japanese Canadian farmers, that's what they wanted to do if they wanted to survive and thrive and raise their families and build farms. And so they enacted this and took part in this, which is kind of, for me, just one aspect of this sort of layered history of thinking about land and thinking about Japanese Canadian settlers doing this kind of work at that time, and how they're forced into this and also making decisions to do this. So inside Autumn Strawberry, there's a kind of acknowledgement to that. And so I gave the power to these trees, or these tree kami. In my research, the Issei generation were not afraid to show their Japaneseness. So they retained, like in Strawberry Hill, villages where they had their own Japanese language, churches, schools, and they were not afraid to be visibly Japanese despite the kind of racisms around them. And they really believed that if you were bestowed land, that you should treat it with care and love and respect, as if as if it had a spirit itself. And so a lot of these farmers also wrote poems and odes to the land, and there's this evidence that they had a different relationship that was very much still considered very Shinto, or which is the religion, the Japanese religion, that all things have life, like all things in the room and everything has life, and to hold those values. So there were these other elements that were coming forward in my research around that as well. So Autumn Strawberry became a series of these short stories that kind of cycle through 60 minutes. And when I talk about sort of the gaps and the silences, it's also for me in my research to look at things that are not within the community. So there were also interviews conducted with non-Japanese Canadian farmers that lived beside Japanese Canadian farmers, and they also sort of kind of spoke about their perspective. It's also looking at things that were happening in the news and kind of pairing and layering that inside this 60-minute experience. I'm going to jump into, so the other work that's in the gallery is Tides and Moons, Herring Capital, photographed by Teresa Donk Matlock, sitting in the front row. And that work was an invitation by Jesse Birch to think about Japanese Canadian families that had connections to Nanaimo in the pre-war. And in the pre-war, there were over 40 Japanese herring salteries. And that was because there was a tax salt in China. And so Nanaimo became the herring capital, because that's how they made salt, is that this process of salting herring. And it looked kind of like that. And that's an image from Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center. And so the installation, Tides and Moons, is a single story based on a song. That's the animation here. And it was through an interview with Naomi Sawada, who works at the Balkan, her father, who was a child and remembers that his father was a young boy in the Ode boat camp. That's on the Seisuchun side. When you land in Nanaimo, it's on the Seisuchun side. And he recalled that they had, again, similarly, the Issei generation kept things like sumo They had an onsen bathtub. They had their own schools. They had all their their small village, and they had these sultries. And different white supremacist groups would come and burn them down. So there were these traces of that in the archive of mysterious fire, sultry burnt down, and then within a few months, it's back up again and running, and then burnt down. And I wanted to kind of document that and tell that story. And the piece is it's subtitled, but not narrated through words. And the reason for that being is he remembers that when herring was hauled up and through the Seine boats, that they would sing particular Japanese folk songs. And that was a way of as a team singing that you received this big cast of herring. And so the animation pays homage to this Japanese traditional folk song performed by Maiko Yamamoto and Sawagi Taiko. And through that work, a thing that also happens for me also is that returning back to this idea of an object. When I'm doing dense research material, and often that's work around also traumatic histories and things, my hands need to make something. And so in most recent works, you'll see I'll do a large edition of chrysanthemums, or in this case, herrings. And it's this idea that it's a different practice, but a similar practice of making with my hands, but making many. And so alongside Tides and Moons, Herrings, Capital, I just started to produce a whole bunch of these porcelain herrings and made shoals and shoals of herring. And that also is a way where craft, I think also there's a healing aspect of working with hands and making. And so there's a series of automatons in the room also, where children or people or families can spin the wheel of the automaton. And in traditional Japanese cinema, they say that toy theater, or this frame by frame moving, is a way of storytelling in a silent film era, but also an example of early animation or early storytelling. So those are there. One really great or powerful thing that also happens when I do this work in community is, and this is something that it happens with most of my work, is other things spiral out. And so for Tides and Moons, we started having conversations with other current Steveston Japanese Canadian fishermen, or people that have had families in Steveston, so not Nanaimo, to think about this dish, thinking about herring, but also thinking about what's called kazunoko kombu, which actually there are traces of Japanese Canadian issei saying this is something they learned from Indigenous individuals, where you leave the seaweed out and the herring eggs stick to this, and that's how they have kazunoko kombu back in a certain era, and it's something that is distinct that they remember. And Jesse asked if I could come back and do some a public program around food. And so this is a dish of salmon and chagai. So chagai is a Japanese Canadian fisherman's meal, which is essentially boiled rice with tea. And it was interesting. So through this project, as I cast out this call for Japanese Canadian fishermen, people that knew about kazunoko, herring, this sort of thing, a man came forward and said, I think I have the last of this ichinensha, which was back in the pre-war days, Japanese Canadians that came from Wakayama smuggled these plants. That was this very pungent, a leaf tea. And you could learn about it here in this Edible Roots, a cookbook that I found. But it's an ichinensha tea plant that they smuggled and they had in Steveston. And it came from Wakayama. And you could technically boil this plant. And he actually was like, if you're doing a show in Nanaimo and you're doing a public program, take some of my last tea. And I felt terrible because this container is this big, but there's only like this much tea left. And I was like, oh, I don't need to take the tea. But he's like, take it, feed the people that come to your show. So Makiko Hara and I were invited to do a cooking show where she dressed up as a herring egg. And I tried to find a photo of that, but I didn't. She dressed up as a herring egg and I was the host. It's a great photo. And we cooked this meal for 50 people and told stories around that. And Makiko, as somebody who's from Japan, linked the Kazunoko kombu also to the indigenous Ainu in Japan that also had this similar practice as well. And we were trying to see if there were ties to that as well. Yeah, it was a very fun cooking show. I'm just gonna jump a little bit also into how food stories come kind of tumbling out again. And this work, jumping back to 2012, was a piece that was part of a group exhibition at the old Center A called To and From, curated by Annabelle Vaughn and Makiko Hara. It was a group show, and that was sort of my first working with Makiko. And she had asked me to think about taste memory, and thinking about the venue of Center A at the time was the old BC Electric train station, so the main train station that's scooped in. And to think about the neighborhoods in the downtown east side, the old Pauerugai, which was the Japantown there, and to think about something that we could work on that's about recipes or food. And so I was curious about, I think there was 13 to 20 or so confectionery shops or these traditional Japanese candy shops that you could find along Powell, up Alexander, Cordova. And I tried to find any elders that were still alive that remembered that, and there were maybe 5 at the time, and asked them to think about all the sweets that they ate, all the different kinds of candies. And so I was invited to their home. They would describe like a certain cinnamon candy, a fortune-telling cookie, a candied ginger, all these different kinds of candies. And they would kind of remap their route as a child, taking a penny, because that's how much it costs for that candy, and finding their way to their favorite candy store. And in the installation, you arrive into this tatami room where there was this kind of old traditional architecture of candy that I made. Some of them bought, because candy corns we couldn't make, but that's candy corn and Smarties is like through the decades have survived, so we just bought those. But the other ones, the sweet red bean cakes, I worked with a seniors group called Tonarigumi, and they still make these traditional cakes. And so we made them and we offered them in the space, and you could listen to the interviews of these 5 elders, of which I think 4 have passed now and only 1 survives. And yeah, their voices are retained inside the telling of the candy. Inside the work that I do, those kind of ties with groups still remain. So Tonarigumi and I have carried on and have done 2 more projects since then. So very recently, in 2023, I did a work called Hatobue Choir, working with a group of artists to create a Japanese talisman flute. And this is just coming out of the pandemic, so I was thinking about lungs and breath and breathing. And they worked with me for 3 months to make a lucky talisman. So a Hatobue flute is something that you would give to a sick child or to a family that needs good luck. And so they made their own flutes and designed them and built meanings around them. And on the last day did this concerto, which was very wild. And then going back a couple years in 2015, curated by Vanessa Kwan, we did a project called Shako Club. So yesterday with the Women's Art Initiative, I introduced Shako Cup, but this was the lunch program that we did. And in this project, I think I worked with them for 3 months, and they designed a culinary food bento based on the concept of land, mountain, water. So every traditional Japanese lunch kit is packed by a loving and caring mom, auntie, or grandma, and has the 3 elements: mountain, land, and water. And what that means is you pick something like a fruit that may represent mountain. You pick something like a carrot or potato that might represent land, and water could be fish. It could be something like watermelon. And in this case, I think there's a salmon under there, but if you look at the top, they hulled out limes and they filled it with agar-agar jelly, and it's a little watermelon jello that they made. When Vanessa and I conceived of this, they wanted me to create a work where artist audiences could get an edition of some kind. And so in order to get a bento box as an audience member, you would sign in, you'd receive this questionnaire, you'd have to answer a bunch of questions like what's the last book you read? What's the most important thing right now in your life? All these, there's like about 50 questions. And then the elder would make the lunch box and the contents inside just for you. And you'd arrive on the week for this one-on-one, what I would call a performance, where she shares the bento with you and tells you exactly what's in it, seals it, and hands it off. And then we wanted to make sure that that action of reciprocity was intact, so you'd have to bring a gift for the senior that packed that lunch. So people were coming with like big artworks, like paintings or like, you know, scarves and this kind of thing. So, and that was the exchange. So it's important for me as I make this work that I also don't just extract, and that I constantly feed back into the community. So it means for me constantly building trust and actively engaging myself in different ways and interweaving myself with this kind of intergenerational learning and making. How are we for time? Am I babbling forever? 2:45. I'll just talk about one more project and I'll end it. Yeah? Okay. I thought I'll end with this really, I'll talk about a work that it's not in the gallery, but it's a piece that when we think about the term that I had said, artwork as a kind of constellation making, this is a project that spanned from 2014 to 2017 called Rock, Paper, Scissors. And it's a multimedia work curated by Makiko Hara, and it came about during a residence in Yonago in Japan. And I was invited to a residency called Air Yonago, and Yonago is on the, not the Pacific side, but the Japan sea-facing side of Japan. And it's said to have the most haunted ghost stories and monster folklore and creatures. And I had been there already because I was very interested in the work of Shoji Ueda, who's a black and white photographer. And this is his work called Papa, Mama, and Children, 1948. And he was a post-war photographer that shot a lot of family portraiture that influenced my work as somebody in Japan making photography. And Yonago also has a sand dune. So if anyone has seen the film Woman in the Dunes, it was filmed there, which was that book by Kobo Abe. And I was also interested in Mizuki Shigeru, who is a Japanese manga artist, and he was interested in yokai and ghosts. So I was already in the know of this region, and Makiko thought, oh, what a perfect pairing to bring Kan Lee and myself there to come up with projects. And so Yonago is a canal town, which means that you'll go down the street, but you'll see these long canal passages because that's where the trade happened. So boats would come in and offload things and fish and stuff from through the Japan seaside. So you'll see these long canals. And we were asked to kind of respond to something that resonated in the site and a site specificity of this place. And I couldn't really find anything. I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And wanting to create something meaningful for the community and as well. And I came across this man. Well, first I came across these, and of course, Cindy Mochizuki is going to be drawn to like these three waving kappa. And so kappa are basically these mythical creatures that have a bowl of water on their head. And that's where the kappa retains all its magical power. And they could be tricksters and they could play evil tricks too, but they could also bring good luck. And if you want them to lose their power, you have to trick them to bow so that the water falls out and then they've lost their power. So I was drawn to this waving kappa, and there was a man there, and he said, for $10, you can hop on my this boat tour that I do. And I was like, oh, okay. So we all hopped on this boat tour, and he took us out. And his tour was all about the gentrification of location. So it wasn't like people are going on there and he's like, people are, this body of water, this kind of a lagoon that we had is a place where families used to come. Now there's garbage everywhere. And so he talked about the gentrification of the place and gave us this very telling tour about how this place had become damaged and ruined by people and tourists and the environment. And it was a really and he's sitting there with the crackly radio and laughing and telling us a story. So for $10, we got this different viewpoint of Yonago. And then we were taken to a couple of different places through that were just now abandoned. And so this region of Yonago used to have, or has predominantly mostly seniors, because everybody just wants to leave this area and go to Tokyo. So we would kind of walk, Makiko would take us through these spaces where you just see these abandoned old eyeglass shop with these mysterious holes or portals in the sky. And I was particularly drawn to this mysterious eyeglass shop, and for sure, but I was also drawn to this weird island. So as we do his tour, he circles this island. And I tapped on the guy's shoulder and I said, "So what is this island?" And he said, "I don't know. But when I was young, my dad told me there was a woman there that made the best noodles." And that's all he said. And he left, and I said to Makiko, "Well, do you think that maybe I can do a piece about the mysterious island?" And she had her cigarette, and "I don't know, do whatever you feel." Well, you know how Makiko is. "Holy crow, whatever, you can do whatever." Anyway, so then I was like, okay, so it happened to be that around 1899, there was a boom of migration from that area, Yonago, Totori, altogether, to Main Island because of the twinning. They really thought it was similar. And I had started to do this research about Japanese migration from Totori. And this kind of also dovetailed back to Autumn Strawberry, but started to find just stories of these loggers or these people that had come from Yonago to start tomato farms in Main Island, join to be part of the logging industry. These are some other images that I found, and also do work around in Port Alice. And there was a man named, I have to remember his name. He was a Japanese-Canadian man, I want to say Kojima, but he basically was the first person from Yonago. And in the archive, he's there and he works at Port Alice. And then after in the archives you read, he just mysteriously disappeared. And I was fascinated with this man and wanting to bring his story forward, quickly wrote in the archives a story called Paper. And it's about a Japanese woman that's making noodles in the island of Kayashima. And through her menu, this hole opens up and she's able to kind of pass through the Trans-Pacific over to Main Island. And it tethers these stories of migration together. As this is happening now, Makiko and I ended up being on the news. And people started coming forward with old graphic design and signs about this island and the restaurant. And I come back in 2014 to do the re-recorded Paper. Makiko says, "You have to do the story in Japanese. No one will understand it in English." So it was a Japanese audio piece that I had to record. And so we asked if I could collaborate with the man on the boat. And you take the tour, pay $10, which goes to him. You pop your headsets and you hear the story of Paper. And then once you're cast out to sea, you take off your headsets and he begins his tour of the disappearance of that lagoon. And that starts off, the mayor comes forward and says, "Oh, I have something to offer." And it becomes this snowball of things. And we leave Yonago being, wow, that was very strange. And I'm sure more things are to come. And I'm just going to speed through this. Sean Dacey brought the work in 2016 and asked for me to do the English version of the work, Paper, as part of the contemporary art off-gallery piece on one of those Granville Island tiny boats. And it was raining, and we walked through, and you end up having a fisherman's feast at the end. And then strangely in 2016, that mysterious eyeglass shop group where I showed the image of the portal, they said, "Hey, let's bring that Canadian artist back and ask if we can keep doing research about that island. And it became this wild thing. I've never had this experience before where the news media completely started following Makiko and I, and we looked like Indiana Jones with our hats. We were getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. It was so hot, we were swollen, Makiko's vein burst, like all these things were happening, and we were on the news, and so they decided that they would allow this Japanese Canadian artist to enter the island in this terrible outfit. These are all over the media in Japan. And as we're going through, we found the staircase to the restaurant. Wow. And this is terrible. Like, these photos of me in the news with Makiko were everywhere, and people were excited about it. And a woman came forward, hello, hi, I'm 99 and I'm gonna cycle to meet Cindy and tell her I know everything about this island. And she arrives and we're excited and we set up everything, and she goes, okay, and I remember the cold glass of water I had with my dad on the boat. And that's what she remembered about the island. And we were like, what? And then she's like, and I remember exactly what that restaurant looked like. And she drew this, and she drew this. That's what it looked like. And I was like, oh my goodness. But that's memory work, and that's kind of what it's all about. And it inspired me to write a trilogy series called Rock, Paper, Scissors. And Rock is about the coal industry in Cumberland. Paper is about the lumber and wood industry of these produced by these Japanese Canadian settlers. And then Scissors takes place in the future, and I worked with a group of kids, asked them to imagine what a 30-foot monster might look like in the year 2100, and they produced these images, and that's what the piece ended up becoming. It's 3. I'm gonna end it there. And the installation ends up looking something like this, where there is the tea house, and we use the replica of the woman's drawings, and you get to sit through this multimedia storytelling work of those 3 works. Okay, I'm gonna end there. Anyways, thank you so much.